morning, everybody. Welcome to our journey, our virtual road trip to the Poe Cottage. And we're really excited about getting there. And we're going to do it right now. Here is Roger McCormack. Good morning, Roger.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me?
Oh, yeah, we can hear you fine and dandy. How are you doing today?
I'm very well.
Roger, how long have you been with the Poe Museum?
I've been at the Bronx County Historical Society, who administers the Edgar Allan Poe Cottage, for 2 years now.
Okay, so you're part of the Historic Society and they oversee the Poe Museum.
That's right. I'm the director of education at the Historical Society.
And
how long? It's been administered by us, the Bronx County Historical Society, since 1975, and it's owned by the city of New York.
Wow. Okay, so how did you get involved with it? How did they say, Roger, we want you here at the Poe Cottage?
I was always interested in history, and particularly New York history, and I was always interested in literature. So it's this perfect kind of marriage of two worlds.
Were you a Poe fan before?
Oh yeah, very much so. So I learned quite a bit more after I started to do the tours. But really, he is the master of the macabre, one of the great geniuses of American literature.
Why do you think he's as popular today as he's been for? I mean, when I mentioned that we were going to the Poe Cottage, we got such a reaction to it. Why do you think Poe is still as popular as he is?
That's a good question. I think in his own time, he was well ahead of his time. Particularly the tales of horror were relatively new at the time. And I think there's something to be said just for his, the cast of his imagination was truly extraordinary. And I think people are drawn to many of his psychotic protagonists and villains. But also as a poet too, he remains very popular. And the poetry is much more, usually more about love and loss and not so horrific. But even there's of course, ominous notes like in The Raven, which he writes, by the way, he writes The Raven, not in Baltimore, contrary to what many people think, but on the Upper West Side in what is then the Brennan Farm.
So he wrote The Raven at your location?
No, not at our location. He wrote it just south of here on the west side of Manhattan, and a place called, it was all farmland then, Upper Manhattan, and it was a place called Brennan Farm. Mm-hmm. They have a little memorial to it today on 84th Street and Amsterdam Avenue.
Yeah, and Hollywood, they found plenty to utilize with his stories going all the way back to the 30s. They were doing, Karloff did The Black Cat, even though it had nothing really to do with the storyline. But Vincent Price, he really made the Poe name prominent during the 60s.
Yes, Poe has had an enormous influence on popular culture and really invents new genres. I mean, the detective story before Poe came on the scene wasn't really defined. And Arthur Conan Doyle, who writes the Sherlock Holmes novels and stories, he says that without Poe, there would have been no Sherlock Holmes. And the story, of course, is that Poe invents the detective genre. It's called The Murders in the Rue Morgue.
Exactly. All right. You know what? I can sense there's people saying, when are we going to get started? So let's move on out, Roger.
Okay. So I'm just going to flip my camera and take you around the cottage. So Poe comes here in 1846, and he lives here until his death in 1849. So it's his last permanent home. It's the oldest Poe museum in the United States. It's first opened in 1913. And it's moved, if you can see out this window, you probably can't, but it was moved from its original location on Kingsbridge Road, just north here, about a block. At the end of the 19th century, the Bronx is becoming urban. When Poe lives here, it's all basically farmland and it's a rural area. And when the Bronx is being urbanized, the house is almost destroyed. And New York Shakespeare Society mobilizes to save it. So as you can see, it's very small. We're entering the parlor. This is the biggest room in the house.
Roger, have they done much restoration in the house?
Yes, there's been a lot of work done, but everything, the floorboards are mostly original, and everything else is how the cottage was described. And most things are period pieces. This rocking chair, though, belonged to Poe. It's an original, as is the mirror on the wall.
Can we get a
And-
closer look at that rocking chair?
Oh, certainly.
Wow.
It's very hard when the students try to sit in it. I have to tell them not to.
Do you get many school groups?
Oh, yes. And all year round, too. We give summer school programs as well. And we also do a number of poetry readings here. Poetry slams, poetry from Poe's Porch is the name of the program. So
And
Poe,
I guess we should tell everybody specifically where you're located, because we have quite a few people from the tri-state area.
we're here in Fordham in the Bronx. When Poe lives here, it's just called the Village of Fordham. Right on the Grand Concourse in East Kingsbridge Road. It's pretty. It's like it's in the middle of the Bronx. It's very easily accessible by subway and by car. And in-person tours are open by appointment.
Now, I mentioned to you earlier before we went on the air, my son, Darren, went to Fordham University, and I recall them saying that they believed that Edgar Allan Poe was inspired by their bell tower to write the bells.
Yes, that's true. And the bell is called Old Edgar, and it's stored at Fordham University. And that Fordham University was a new school when Poe comes here. It just opened in 1841. It was called St. John's College then, and it's about a 10-minute walk from where we are now at the Cottage. You just go down Fordham Road. And Poe really liked to hang out with the faculty there, the professors, and of course then they were all Jesuit, and not lay people. They were priests. But Poe paid them the dubious compliment of saying that they drank, gambled, smoked, and never discussed religion, like perfect gentlemen.
Was he a very sociable person?
Yes, in a way. He was very aristocratic in his demeanor. He was born in Boston. He's orphaned at a young age, and he's taken in by the Allan family of Richmond, Virginia. And John Allan was a wealthy tobacco merchant, slave trader. And so Poe grows up during his early years in this rich, opulent household, but he has an acrimonious and very strained relationship with his foster father, who he never formally adopts him. And Poe eventually joins the army, tries to get a commission at West Point, and then heads to where he fails at both, and then heads to Baltimore, where his aunt Maria Clem lived.
Roger, while you're speaking, can you close in on some of those photographs
Sure.
that are on the wall?
Sure.
Here we go.
I don't know if you can see. This is why it's better in person with the glare, and there's no shades here. But this is an actual photograph of the cottage in its original location from 1884. And standing in front of the cottage here, to the lower right, is Arthur Stoughton, and he was president of the Bronx Society of the Arts and Sciences, and they were a civic group that helped save the cottage from being destroyed, along with the New York Shakespeare Society. And Poe,
how did they acquire it?
they acquired it. The city, they petitioned the city, along with Theodore Roosevelt was involved in this as well. They petitioned the city to save it as a historic landmark, and it was made a city landmark, and today it's on the National Register of Historic Places as well. And Poe moves here because his young wife, Virginia, had contracted tuberculosis while they're living in Philadelphia. And so the idea was that Poe would move here, and the clean country air of Fordham would help her recover. But unfortunately, she dies here in the cottage, and we have her bed. She dies. She's only 24 when she dies. Poe marries her when she's very young. She's only 13 when they're married. Poe is about 26 or 27 at that time. and they were first cousins. So Poe lives here with his wife, Virginia, and with his aunt, Mariah Clem.
Was Virginia the inspiration for the Raven?
The Raven and a number of his other poems too. Annabel Lee, which he writes here, was inspired by her, where he talks about laying down with his bride in the tomb by the sounding sea. And it's a theme, a recurring motif in almost all of Poe's work about people coming back to life, women dying. And even in stories like The Masque of the Red Death, where he describes the ravages of the plague, it's most likely inspired by tuberculosis and what he had seen.
Is that is that a simulation of his writing desk on the left?
Yes, this is what his desk would have looked like, and this is a portable desk. So it could have been taken and moved when Poe had to move, but this is not an original. And on the desk, we have the King James Bible, which influenced a generation of American writers, particularly if you read Moby Dick by Herman Melville, who's also lives in New York for a lot of his life. You can hear the cadences of the King James Bible in his prose. And Poe is kind of down and out during his time in Fordham. He's kind of alienated himself from the New York literary establishment by writing a famous piece called The New York Literati Wars, where he criticizes these various writers for their shortcomings, but also makes a lot of ad hominem comments on people's appearance, on people's physical appearance. And a lot of his he was known as the Tomahawk Man because of his really critical book reviews. And Poe was interested in raising the standard of American writing. And he writes his great tale of vengeance and revenge is written here in the cottage at Fordham, the Cask of Amontillado, where Montresor lures Fortunato into the wine cellar and buries him alive. And that's widely seen as inspired by Poe's quarrels with other New York writers. And on the bookshelf here, you can see Poets of the 19th Century. So it's an anthology. And Poe was noted for working on anthologies and kind of trying to raise the standard of American writing.
He was, as you're indicating, he was a critic for the newspapers for a while. Are his articles published? Is there a book featuring all of his writings?
Oh yeah, if you get a collected works of his, they'll have it. They'll have it divided into poetry, into his stories, his prose, and also his book reviews. And he writes, magazines at the time are becoming similar to the internet in the early 2000s. When Poe lives in the 19th century, magazines have become this new kind of niche thing. They're becoming much more popular. So Poe writes for the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, for Burton's and Graham's magazine in Philadelphia, and for the Broadway Journal and the Evening Mirror in New York City. And he briefly owns the Broadway Journal. And if you're ever in Lower Manhattan at the Beekman Hotel, that's it's not the same building, but that's where the Broadway Journal was published. But Poe didn't really have much business acumen, and he kind of failed as an editor. But it was his lifelong dream to have his own magazine, which he entitled The Stylus. And at the time of his death in 1849, he was trying to raise money by giving a lecture tour of the South. So this bust we're looking at was done in 1909 to commemorate the 100th anniversary of Poe's birth. And it was unveiled in Poe Park, which is just out here, in 1909. It was done by the great New York sculptor Edmund Quinn, who has a number of other busts that he did that are in the Hall of Fame of Great Americans in the Bronx, which is on just south of us. It's on the Bronx Community College campus. Do people have questions for me? Oh yes, the floorboards. Well, I should say the floorboards are original, and there's some that are loose. The Telltale Heart. But we actually have a living caretaker. There's a basement apartment. So there actually is a beating heart beneath the floorboards.
Yes, I have a question. Is the Po Cozy Pub still around across the street from the cottage?
No, unfortunately it's not.
And I think the bus stopped right across from the cottage. Am I right?
Yes, the bus stop is still there, but I don't know when the bar went out of business, but I think it's unfortunately its neighborhood has changed significantly. In some ways, in good ways, in other ways, aren't good. But as you know, New York business in New York is very transient.
I grew up in the area and I remember the cottage and getting off that bus.
Oh, wonderful. Where are you from?
I'm sorry, where am I from?
Yeah, you're from Fordham?
No, I guess they're the amalgamated houses, which is
Oh,
further
okay.
to the north.
Oh, yeah, right on that's on Sedgwick Avenue, isn't it?
Sedgwick, and there's some.
Yes, those are beautiful.
Yeah, and parks too. My parents still live there.
Wonderful. We have a lot. The Bronx County Historical Society has a lot of records about the amalgamated housing and the coops off Bronx Park East, which are really cool architecturally.
I think you did a program maybe a year ago about them.
Yes. My colleague Stephen Payne is very interested in that.
Where does that door lead to, Roger?
This door?
Yeah. And where does this lead to?
So this is the bed that Virginia dies in. Poe said when he writes about her sickness, he talks about this with tuberculosis, this oscillation between Virginia would get better and then get really sick again. And Poe said this drove him crazy. And his great quote is, "I became insane with long intervals of horrible sanity." And Poe himself dies only about 2 years after Virginia dies. And he's trying to woo various women after she dies to get married again. And he's unsuccessful. But despite his misery, he's very creatively successful here. He writes The Bells, inspired by the old Edgar Bell Tower, Bell at Fordham University, Annabelle Lee. He writes his prose poem, Eureka, which Poe considered his best work. And in Eureka, he anticipates some of the findings of the Big Bang of physicists about the creation of the universe. And it's a really interesting work. And he also writes kind of a landscape study called The Domain of Arnhem and Landor's Cottage. And that's inspired by his time at the cottage. And Poe was a great rambler. And at the time, this was like all pretty much open country. And so he could walk a short distance, walking, towards Fordham, and where today the New York Botanical Garden is and the Bronx Zoo. Poe would walk along the Bronx River there. And in Landor's in the Domain of Arnhem, Poe talks about this luxuriant river that has all this greenery and it's beautiful. And of course, he's talking about the Bronx River, which today is starting to look better again. It was for a long time. All the waste from Westchester County went into the Bronx River. And they also had heavy industry that was concentrated along the Bronx River further south of us. And that obviously created a tremendous amount of pollution.
You mentioned about his being rather critical of other writers. Do you know anything about the feud he was having with Bram Stoker?
I'm not familiar with a feud with Bram Stoker, but I know that he called Henry Longfellow a plagiarist, and he had too many enemies. It's hard to keep up.
Yeah, well, Bram wrote a story called The Squaw, and basically Poe felt it had many of the same elements of The Black Cat.
Oh, I see. Yeah, Poe is very quick to kind of accuse other writers of being plagiarists. Mm-hmm. But perhaps one of the few writers he respected, though, was Charles Dickens, who he meets when Dickens is visiting Philadelphia. And that would be, what a meeting that must have been. People always say, who would you want to what historic time would you want to go back to, and who would you want to meet? That would be interesting to sit in on.
There's I have a letter, a short letter from Bram Stoker's mother to Bram. And I'm just going to read it to you. It's very short. My dear Bram, she sent a letter to her son upon the publication of Dracula. So she wrote, my dear Bram, Dracula is a splendid novel, 1,000 miles beyond anything you have written before. I feel certain it will place you very high in the writers of the day. The story and style being deeply sensational, exciting, and interesting. No book since Mrs. Shelley's Frankenstein, or indeed any other at all, come near yours in originality and terror. Poe is nowhere.
Not very nice.
Poe is
Not
nowhere.
very nice.
And it's funny when you really consider the trajectory of both of their careers. Bram, pretty much, Dracula was his signature effort, whereas with Poe, he continually put out product that was sensational.
Oh, so we had a question about if we network with other museums, and we do. We do the most with the Edgar Allan Poe Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. And I was recently down in Baltimore to give a talk for an event called the Virginia Poe Bicentennial, because she was born in 1822. This is the 200th anniversary of her birth. So they had this whole event centered around Virginia Poe, about whom we know very little, other than that she was, a child bride and kind of Poe's muse. And really interesting, and you can find the program on YouTube. And one of the speakers is a literary professor who is a Nabokov scholar. And there's a lot of themes in Lolita that is inspired by Poe. And that the professor in Lolita, Herbert Humphreys, I'm not sure if I'm getting his name right. I think it's the same as the former presidential candidate. But he's a Poe scholar, the professor in the book. And so it was a really interesting program on how Poe kind of inspired Nabokov, and then Nabokov was a great fan of Poe.
It was a very different time period for him to be marrying a cousin and marrying a 13-year-old cousin.
That's a good question. So being first cousins in that time wasn't really taboo, but the age difference was very taboo, even then. So, and Poe there's this brief moment when a relative of Poe, offers to take Virginia in, and Poe goes into this, basically has a tantrum, and threatens to kill himself, and so she doesn't leave. And Poe remains very poor throughout his life, which I don't think I mentioned. I should have. Most writers at the time, due to copyright laws that were non-existent, but most writers had another job. Like Henry Longfellow taught at Harvard. Washington Irving was a statesman and a diplomat. But for Poe kind of viewed this as kind of a prostitution of one's talent. And so for Poe, it was, write well and write solely, or do something else. But unfortunately, as a result of that, he remains kind of poor throughout his life. Had the Allans not cut him off, he would have had a sizable inheritance. But he never gets that, because he's basically disowned. And he's a heavy part of it is his own doing. I mean, he was tremendously productive as a writer, but it's interesting to think about how he did that, because he was a really heavy drinker, particularly when he was away from his wife and his.
What was the scandal about his death?
Well, I was going to tell you that we're upstairs, if I can talk about it now. So he's found on the street.
Oh, let's go upstairs. Let's see something.
Oh no, I just wanted to show you a few more things down here. Can everyone see? You can see this well.
Yep.
Glare isn't bad. So this is Poe walking on the High Bridge. If you're driving today on the Major Deegan, you would drive right under this bridge. It's a footbridge now. You can walk over it, and it's built in 1848. It's the oldest bridge in New York City, and it was built as part of the old Croton Aqueduct system, as part of the aqueduct where it crosses from the Bronx into Manhattan. And the Croton Aqueduct had been finished in 1842. And before that, people in the city relied on cisterns and drinking wells for water. And of course, when you have a big burgeoning population, you get a lot of waterborne disease, and also a problem fighting fires. So this is one of the great triumphs of urban planning, shall we say. And Poe lives here at a very interesting time. As I say, this is all the country then, but there was a commuter railroad where the Metro North is today on Fordham Road. It was called the New York and Harlem Railroad, and the stop at Fordham had recently been built. So Poe could take the train down into Manhattan to meet with his publishers, where we're about 13 miles from Manhattan, like from lower Manhattan. So for Poe, if he didn't have a train, he would have had to take a horse and buggy, and that would take what, 12 to 13 hours, something extraordinary. And Poe was also unusual in his time in being very nomadic. Many cities have claimed him. He identified personally as a Southerner and as Baltimorean, but he has all these really interesting ties to all these places. And he went, he basically went where the money was, where publishing was well established. So Philadelphia, and then of course in New York, he first comes to Manhattan in 1844 and lives by where NYU is today. Though NYU destroyed one of his former apartments, and I'm always amused when NYU is giving a talk or lecture on Poe, and I suppose I have a guilty conscience.
Yeah, Roger, who is the artist that did that work right there with him on the bridge?
This was done by Jacob Rosenmeyer in the 1930s, 1932.
Do you know what inspired him to create that?
I'm just inspired by the history of this area, the history of Poe's, of all the writing we have that Poe loved to walk along the High Bridge and along the Bronx River, and then to meet with the Jesuit faculty and have a few drinks before he started writing again. So here is a print. This is a little harder to see, but this is a print called from the Stylus, which, as I said, at the time of his death, Poe was trying to raise money for. Poe kind of really chafes under editors. He doesn't like being told what to do. And there was something to that. I mean, a lot of them were very mediocre and just wanted to make as much money as they could. And Poe's stuff sold very well, but Poe himself usually wasn't the recipient of the money he had helped make for magazines. This is perhaps the most famous image of Poe. It's a daguerreotype, and he looks really haunted here. You can see the ravages of his wife's death had on him and of his alcoholism. And this was taken in 1848 in Providence. Poet, and by Poe's own account, he had just tried to kill himself in Boston with an overdose of laudanum, which is opium dissolved in alcohol.
If you were going to create a character that wrote horror stories, boy, he looks the part.
Yeah, it's really, it would be interesting. I mean, he's obviously like a type, like a archetype, right? Like Hemingway, and there's so many other writers who were self-destructive, but Poe had a really hard life.
All right, you were going to take us upstairs, you said?
Oh, yes. Oh, I just want to show you a few more things down here. So this is from an exhibit at the Brooklyn Museum from the 1950s. And it's based on Poe's work, The Philosophy of Furniture. It's kind of very tongue-in-cheek work where Poe is describing, basically the perfect interior decorating scheme. And he talks about you have to have this unity of style. Everything has to be orderly and blend into one another. And what he's really talking about is how to write a good story. Poe writes this in a work called The Philosophy of Composition, where the unity of effect of having one single theme and all the other components of the story lead into that theme is the most important thing. Here is, Here is a drawing of the cottage that was done in the 1880s by the artist Gustave Mercier. And this shows how the cottage would have looked in its original location. There were apple trees near it. Very bucolic, very rural. And Poe could walk, this is unbelievable to think about, but Poe could walk a short distance and see the hills of Long Island. And we've built all these buildings. I suppose we call it progress, but something is lost, I think. Okay, let's go upstairs. This is barely like 13 paces across. It's very cool. I want to say one more thing about Virginia. So when Virginia dies, they're so poor that she's buried in the family crypt of the Valentine family, who was the family that owned this house. And the house was built for farm laborers. And it was one of a series of houses that would have dotted the area in the 19th century. And it's the only remaining 19th century structure like this in Fordham today, and one of only a few in the Bronx. And it's a legend that's perhaps true, that an early Poe biographer, William Gill, when they were destroying, razing the Valentine Cemetery, and the legend is that he took Virginia's he took her bones from the cemetery, put them in a box, and kept them under his bed for years, and eventually brought her bones to Baltimore. And so she's buried with Edgar Allan Poe today and his Aunt Mariah Clem in Baltimore. So I'm gonna go upstairs now. Oh, ask me questions, please. I'm talking too much.
No, you're very informative.
Here's a cutout of Poe. He was about 5'7", which was fairly normal size for that time. And the ceilings are very low, and people always ask me, are the ceilings low because he was so short? And I say no, it's because of his poverty. And the other houses are very modest as well, and they're all like on the outskirts of cities. So his row house in Baltimore is in West Baltimore, very, very modest. And the one in Philadelphia is also just north of like the main drag. I think it's Spring Gardens, I believe is the name of the neighborhood. But Poe lives, in the center of cities, but he kind of prefers living on the rural outskirts. So this room here, and I can send you, we usually show a film, but I can just send it to you on YouTube. I can send it via YouTube. But this would have been the Poe bedroom. And when Virginia got very sick, she moved downstairs. And this room here would have been Poe's writing room. He would have written here and written downstairs, writing desk there.
Was there heat in the building when they were there?
He had to heat, he had to basically have the chimney going. I think I showed you the fireplace downstairs, and he would have used that for heat. It would have been easier to heat because of the low ceiling, which was a factor in their building. So this is an acrylic on canvas. It was done by Poe by a Bronx senior citizen. It's based on a daguerreotype that was taken of Poe while he was in either Richmond or Philadelphia.
We do have a couple of questions.
Oh yeah, let me read this. I'm sorry.
No. Is there an outhouse?
I think there was at the time, but it's not. It's destroyed. I'm sorry to say.
All right. And someone asked, what is that cylindrical thing in one room?
Oh, this is a series of images of Poe. So these are all photographs of him, drawings of him. It doesn't turn well, I'm sorry to say.
You mentioned that he didn't have much money, but he's very well documented with photographs.
Yeah, I think people just, I think his fame was great, and he wouldn't have to really pay people to do it. You know what I mean? I don't think there was. I think he was he was a very romantic person as well. He had kind of that tragic component to him that was attractive and that people were drawn to. I think it gets him in trouble, particularly in there's a famous scandal where he's writing these. So after he writes The Raven in 1845, he becomes very famous, though not financially successful. And he's given entree in these New York literary salons where he's hobnobbing with all these other writers and kind of being very well received. But he begins a romance with two different women at the salons. And and then one of them was married already, and there was talk of a duel. And so Poe is kind of excommunicated from the New York literary salons after that.
I recall reading that one of his frustrations is that people would print his poems in their newspapers without giving him any kind of financial reward.
Yes, and at the time there was no copyright, so that a lot of publishers and booksellers would just import British works and sell them for like dirt cheap. And so Poe was involved in this. It was a nationalist movement, but Poe was just only really interested in it because he wanted to establish copyright laws so American writers weren't taken advantage of. And someone had asked about, someone from Boston identifying as a Southerner. So Poe is, he's kind of just born there, and he grows up in Richmond, Virginia, but he hates New England, really hates it. He identifies Boston as like this coterie of really snobbish, overrated writers. And he's also, and he despises, there's a dark side of Poe as a Southerner at that time. He despises abolition, the abolitionist movement, and is basically from his writings, didn't have any real problem with slavery. And one of his biographers, Kenneth Silverman, writes that had he lived, 20 years later, he would have been a firm supporter of the Confederacy during the Civil War.
Hey, Roger, before you leave that room with the chairs and all,
Yes.
How did the pandemic affect you? How did it affect the museum proper?
Well, first we'll talk about how the good things. So my family is from New Jersey, and I was there this weekend, and I came back last night, and it took me 3 hours to get here. And during the pandemic, it was much faster. So what we do is we close the houses until soon after the vaccine rolled out, or actually no, about 4 or 5 months before the vaccine rolled out, I started giving in-person tours again. But in the early phases of the pandemic, I was doing everything virtually. And we kind of changed things up a little bit. We don't have clear-cut opening hours anymore. We do everything by appointment. So that's going to change soon.
And what kind of programs do you offer?
We offer tours of the Poe Cottage. And we have another museum. It's called the Museum of Bronx History. It's called the Valentine Varian House, and that's a 1758. It was built in 1758. It's a farmhouse. It was built by Isaac Valentine, who was a blacksmith and a farmer in the 18th century. And it sees a lot of action during the American Revolution. It's occupied, it's used as headquarters. It's occupied by the Hessians and the British. And the famous French general, who was commander of French forces in America, Rochambeau, he famously sleeps there. And that's it's the only remaining farmhouse from the 18th century. The oldest house in the Bronx is the Van Cortlandt House Museum on Broadway. And that's a really wealthy abode. They were the upper crust at the time. And so at the cottage, we offer various things. We offer poetry readings, poetry slams, creative writing workshops, readings outside of Poe's poetry from his porch, and a lot of lectures and Zoom talks and in-person tours. And you can look us up on YouTube. Our handle is Jonas Bronk. And also, if you look up Poe Baltimore, there's a number of things we've done. I should take some of the videos and use it for our own page, but I haven't. I let Poe Baltimore do that work. But there's a number of programs there you can watch that are really interesting about Poe. Let's see if we have questions here. His wife, yes, his wife was only 24. The Virginia Poe writes Poe this really nice acrostic poem, and it spells out Poe's name. And I don't know it from memory, but I encourage people to look that up. It's very nice romantic poem. Oh, and you can see, I can show this poster here. So this is a poster. You see Poe in the middle, and you see that it shows images from a number of Poe's stories. So the 8th is from The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is the first detective story. And Poe invents all the tropes. So there's a brilliant bachelor detective, Auguste Dupin. He has a dim-witted sidekick like Dr. Watson. And of course, the police are incredibly inept and stupid, like Lestrade and Sherlock Holmes. And it also shows where he lives. So you see the Bronx. And I'm very sorry to say there's a big landscaping project going on. So when we go outside, it's not going to look as nice as it usually does, but it will look really nice when it's finished. But the work in the city takes a lot longer than in other places.
That's a
So
beautiful frame.
Yeah, the Black Cat. See Richmond, Virginia. The bells. See his house in Baltimore, his little row house. And this is Poe is very interested in overseas exploration. In his only novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, like it's like almost like a King Kong kind of story where this vessel is going into this uncharted land and having all these adventures. And Poe writes that basically inspired by his brother Henry, who had been a sailor and who also dies young from alcoholism. And here is The Pit and the Pendulum. Oh, I'm sorry to leave this room. This is where the fan is. There's no AC in here. So here's a photograph of Poe's tomb in Baltimore, where he's buried with his Aunt Mariah Clem and with his wife Virginia. And there's about 15 different causes that have been attributed to Poe's death. One of the most recent ones is kind of more interesting. The theory is he died of rabies. He's found in the street in Baltimore wearing clothes that aren't his own, and he's raving and hysterical. And he's taken to the hospital and dies the next day. And the theory around rabies is that Poe refused water and that rabies is hydrophobic. So that's the theory. But other theories are that he had hypoglycemia, that it was just a final alcoholic bender, or that he had delirium tremens, which he had suffered from before. He was on the train, I think to Philadelphia, and he thought to Richmond, and he started hallucinating that these people on the train were going to kill him. So, Poe is not, did not have an easy time. And the other legend is that it was election day in Baltimore, and that Poe might have been the victim of cooping, where these kind of partisan thugs would like kind of kidnap people and get them drunk and dress them up in different outfits to take them to the same polling place to vote again. So 19th century voting fraud. Here's the glare's not good.
Roger,
here.
do they have any children at all?
No, there's no children. And there's some people don't question whether it was even consummated. But I can't speak about that. I'm not an expert.
And he never got any of his royalties for the work that they published?
I don't understand the question. Did Poe ever get any royalties from his plagiarized work?
From the plagiarized work that was being distributed. Yeah.
I don't. Oh, you mean like by Bram Stoker? I don't know. I don't think so. But Poe himself borrows from other writers. So, and it's hard to tell, he might have been, Poe, I don't know if it was true, he might have been overstating it, with like horror stories, that there's like a little linkage, is that plagiarism, or was Poe just kind of taking offense where he, was his ego just bruised, and it was actually plagiarism?
Hey, Roger, just so you know, we only have a few minutes left. Do you want to go back down?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You had another room down here you wanted to
Yeah,
show us?
I'll show you the kitchen. So here's the kitchen. Very small, as you can see. And the
Okay,
stove.
just slow down a little. Okay.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. The stove here is not original. It was built in 1853. It was manufactured by the Beebe Iron Works in the South Bronx. In the South Bronx, in Mott Haven, which is named for Jordan Mott, he had his factory there, and Jordan Mott invented the coal burning stove. And the South Bronx is very interesting. Both the Capitol Dome and the Lincoln Memorial were forged by Bronx companies. The Piccarelli brothers did the Lincoln Memorial, and Jane Kirtland and Sons did the Capitol Dome. So these are all period pieces. This is how the kitchen would have looked based on our writings and descriptions of it. Poe had a good friend, Marie Shue, who was a doctor, and she often came to visit and said that despite their poverty, the cottage was very genteel, very clean, and that Maria Clem kept very good house. And this door leads down to the shed into the caretaker's apartment. Oh, Poe, I forgot to mention this about plagiarism. Poe does win a libel suit related to the women he was romancing, and has this feud he gets in with one of his friends, Thomas Dunn English, and that he's able to get some money from that shortly before his death. But Poe's reputation suffers really immensely. One of Poe's rivals as an anthologist and a poet was a man named Rufus Griswold. And Poe didn't really understand that Griswold had this animus for him, which mostly originated over just like little criticisms Poe had made of him. And under very kind of strange agreement, Griswold becomes Poe's literary executor, and in his capacity in that position, uses it to just basically destroy Poe's reputation and exaggerate some of Poe's like vices into this theory that he was like a heroin addict and a psychotic, which wasn't true. But so in the Victorian era, he's kind of unpopular in America. It's also because of the time, it's very buttoned up and genteel. And Poe, Poe stuff about us, beating people to death and killing cats. It didn't go down as well with that era. But he's very popular in France. The French decadents love him, and in Germany. And to this day, we have a lot of people that come from Europe to see the cottage and to see the other Poe museums.
Roger, are his works now in public domain?
Pardon me?
Are his works in public domain at this point?
Oh yeah, I don't think there's any. Wouldn't he have to have like living descendants for that to?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think there's any.
Oh, this is your gift shop?
Yeah, this is a gift shop. I don't know how well you can see it. I mean, the Bronx County Historical Society has an online store, and I'll send you a link to that, and you can share it with your audience. We have books about Poe. Books about.
Do you have one book that you recommend about Poe?
I really like the Kenneth Silverman biography of Poe, which is called Mournful and Never-Ending Remembrance. To me, that's the definitive one. And it's a bit easier to read than the older one by Arthur Quinn, which is...
Say that title again, a little slower.
Edgar Allan Poe, a biography, Mournful and Never-Ending Remembrance.
And they can purchase that through your gift shop?
I'm not sure if it's here. I think it should be on our online store, but if it's not, it's on Amazon.
I have a link to it here. I have a link to it that I'll show everybody.
But some of our books about the Bronx you can't get on Amazon, and you should buy it from us and consider a donation to the Bronx County Historical Society in these trying times. You know, all the money would go to the upkeep of the house and for our programs.
Yeah, we always encourage our guests if they can donate something to the to these museums. They've gone through a really difficult time since the pandemic broke out. Many of them, we lost two of them since we began. Two prominent museums. One of them was, hate to say it, the Ginger Rogers Museum ended up closing down, and there's another one ended up being sold because they couldn't maintain it, and that was the Lizzie Borden Museum. We did their tour about 2 years ago, but it is not easy for these non-for-profits to maintain these buildings, especially in today's world. Very difficult.
Where are you in Long Island? If you don't mind me asking.
We got guests from all over Long Island. We're out east, but
Okay.
I would love to see where people are located. If you would put it in your
I'm
chat,
working.
just let us know where you're located.
And if we're working to do some programs, hopefully soon, with the Walt Whitman Museum.
Okay, we have Montclair, New Jersey. We have
Wonderful.
We have Illinois, we have Florida, we have Indiana, Iowa, oh my gosh, Texas, Connecticut, Chicago, Port Jefferson here on Long Island, Columbia, Maryland, near Baltimore, North Carolina, Huntsville, Alabama, Chicago, Illinois, Kew Gardens, Queens. Oh my gosh, Indiana. We have the best group in the world. Wisconsin.
I'm going to include my email address for people if they want to send
We're going to put it in there for you. We're going to send out a follow-up email, which will tell everybody about how they can contact you, and they'll be able to purchase the book or leave a donation. But they'll get in touch with you, I promise.
Okay.
Ontario, Canada, the UK. Wow, this is wonderful. And folks, we do not take that lightly. We really appreciate you being here.
I wanted to show you just two more things if I have time.
Yeah,
definitely. This is a postcard we sell. This is an image of Virginia Poe, and this was taken posthumously. This is 19th century, is a very different time. And supposedly tuberculosis was supposed to give women this like rosy glow that people thought was attractive. Very strange. But so this was done. This is a posthumous image of Virginia Poe. And now let's go outside. I'm sorry about this landscaping. It should be done by the winter, early winter in December. But I'm going to show. Bugger. I'm going to turn my camera off just briefly and then go outside. Is that okay?
Okay.
I don't want to disturb the caretaker.
Hey, Dad, did you see this one viewer, India?
Oh, really?
India. Wonderful.
Can't thank them enough. Okay, Roger is going to be back in 1 second. He's taking a detour.
Okay, so you see it's very urban now, very loud. It's not the country anymore. And this road here is called the Grand Concourse. It was built in 1909. It was modeled after Champs-Élysées. It's our Fifth Avenue. And in the 20s and 30s and 40s, it was one of the most coveted places of real estate in New York City. And if you said you lived on the concourse or you lived a few blocks from the concourse, you're basically saying you're upper class. So here's the Cottage. Platform has a gable roof, very small. Very kind of incongruous today. You see all these modern buildings. Well, not modern, but built between the First and the Second World War. And this building, of course, is considerably older. Okay, everyone. Thank you very much.
Okay, Cassandra, do you want to show the pages you have?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just do this here. All right, I did.
Wow, you have you have a really interesting, you have a really interesting audience. I can't believe how many different places people are from.
Absolutely.
Holy cow.
So I will
Tremendous.
include this in the follow-up email. This is the poem that Roger was talking about that she wrote for him, and along the side, Edgar Allan Poe. So I'll include that so everybody can read it. Right here, when you go to the BronxHistoricalSociety.org, they have their museum store, but there is specifically a Poe store. So any of those things that you wanted to look at, this is the book he was referring to, the biography. Tons of wonderful things to look at and purchase here. There's a second page. Don't need that anymore. And as always, please take a look at the website and keep up to date with what we have going on. We have a lot of great programs coming up.
Whoa, slow
And-
down.
Whoa, sorry. All right, I was trying to get back down to.
I want to know where we're going. What's coming up? There we go. Nope, that's
that one's passed. But we do. Here we go. Here are
okay. We're
main
going
ones
to the
coming up.
Titanic Museum in Tennessee.
Mhm.
And we have two interesting programs coming up. One on the pre-code era. Everybody's always asking me, what was the pre-code era? What was it all about? And we have a wonderful guest that's going to be coming to tell us all about it. Her name is Kim Luperi, and she knows everything there is to know about the pre-code era. And then we're doing a thing on disabilities in movies. How factual were these films? Movies like Miracle Worker and Rain Man and Forrest Gump. We're going to be looking at those movies and discussing how authentic the portrait. All those movies, by the way, the lead actors or actresses won an Academy Award for their performance. Let's find out how accurate they were. Okay, I'm done with my pitch.
Just taking a look here. Don't get dizzy. Here we go. As always, we have Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. You can follow, like, view videos, everything there. And also a reminder that next week is Labor Day, so we will not be having a lecture, but the following week, as he was saying, the 12th, we have the Sin, Sex, and Cinema in the pre-code period. So
Sounds good.
Say, if I may just add one more thing.
Yeah, Roger.
Can people see?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so where we're looking now, just over down the road, on the corner on the left, where that apartment building is.
Yeah.
That's the original location of the cottage. So you can see here, this is the cottage today, and it was moved, just up a block north. And where I'm standing this is Kingsbridge Road we're looking at, and this goes right down to Fordham Road, and that's basically the heart of the Bronx, the commercial center of the Bronx. It's the busiest shopping district in our borough here. Okay, thank you.
All right, Roger, thank you so much. What a great tour. This was a real treat. Everybody loves the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. You brought it to life for us to see what his life in that cottage was like. Amazing. Well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
thank you.
Stick around, Roger. We're going to close out the show and we'll talk to you in a few minutes. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Thank you.
Once again, see you next time. Hope to, you know what? Keep telling your friends about us. Let's build up our audience even bigger. If we can get to India, we can get anywhere now. This is great. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.